to Ed Leadership, a space where we talk about career skills, purpose, and leadership for the next generation. I'm Gatika, your host and author of the book, I Don't Know My Career Yet, and That's Okay, rooted in helping young people navigate uncertainty and find their own path with confidence. In today's episode, we're exploring the question, can you lead without losing yourself? And I'm really excited to be joined by James Wood, founder of the Growth Network, who support teachers, leaders, particularly middle leaders, in developing sustainability with a focus on well-being, reflection, and impact. So, James, welcome to the podcast, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thank you. And let's go into your journey. So I'm really excited to know more about you. So James, can you share your journey from teaching to founding the Growth Network and what inspired you to focus on supporting middle leaders?
Sure. I was a teacher in a secondary school for 24 years. I was on the senior leadership team for most of that time. And I think the path from teaching to founding the Growth Network started in COVID when I had a great time to slow down and reflect on what was going on in work. I did lots of reading and thinking, and I could see lots of ideas which I thought would really help us in schools to lead better. But I didn't really have time to do anything with them. And also they needed some adaptation from people who are working in different sectors so they could actually be better for us as teachers. So I'd thought for a long time about creating something like this, and I had the opportunity in 2024 to focus on that full time, which I was really pleased to do. And so I began the Growth Network at the end of 2024, and most of that was just doing lots and lots of writing about my experiences and the ideas that I'd had, and thinking about how to take both things, the ideas and the experiences, and use them to help, particularly middle leaders. And that being because I think there's lots of really good programs for head teachers. If you're a trainee, there's lots there, but people in the middle of schools, middle leaders, sometimes those people just moving on to SLT, there's not so much support for them. And that's why I wanted to focus on people in that particular space.
Thank you, James, for sharing this. And I think that's a really interesting journey. So you being a teacher for a number of years and bringing your wealth of experience, gone into range of, your own experiences, and then now building the media leader capacity. Best world. So that's really interesting. So thank you for sharing this. So in your experience, what are the biggest challenges middle leaders face, and how can young people start developing skills to overcome similar challenges early in their careers?
I always think being a middle leader is the hardest job. People assume it's being like at the top of the system. But I think being a middle leader is tough because someone called it the meat and the sandwich. You're stuck between the senior leaders and what they want, and the people you're responsible for and what they want or need. And so unlike senior leaders who generally are sort of passing things downwards, or people at the bottom who are looking up to get support, as a middle leader, you're getting it from all directions all the time. And it's a really tough place to be. And I think it's easy to forget that when you go to senior leadership, because it's such a different job. You just forget what that's like. So I think for a middle leader, it's learning how to balance all of those things. So you've got to do the normal job of a teacher. You've got to be a leader. And you've got to do those things both at the same time. And it just means there's a lot to get done. And I think also when you're in a senior position, you often have a bit more thinking space, and middle leaders generally don't get that. They have to keep going and working a lot, in a very hands-on way. So I think if you're thinking about younger people, it's coming into a career, and I was only a teacher, so I don't know how this is in other professions, but I think it's probably quite similar. You have a fairly straightforward task when you start out. So for a teacher, you've got to teach some lessons. There's not too much more than that you've got to learn. And I think the main thing is get really good at that core task. So when you do come into middle leadership, you've got capacity to do other things because you are more fluent and fluid about what you're doing in the classroom. And then I think the second piece of advice is don't panic. because when you become a middle leader, you suddenly have this range of tasks. It's very challenging. Um, but you just have to keep going at the pace that you can cope with and learn over time. Because I think if you continue as a teacher for 3, 4, 5 years, you become very good at being a teacher and you can do it quite easily, relatively. And the same is true of leadership. Start to get easier because you get into routines and habits. So whilst it may feel a bit overwhelming at the start, the trick is not to allow that to happen. Just do one thing at a time and learn over time, and you'll soon enough find you can cope with what you've got because you get used to doing those different things.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's really insightful. And I think many people underestimate those challenges that you have just shared. So, and when it comes to supporting others, can you share a story from your work where supporting someone else's growth had a lasting impact, and what young learners can take from that?
Do you know, I think I was thinking about this, and um, maybe one of the biggest things I've learned overall is really focus on the person in front of you and doing what you're being asked to do at that moment in time. And that there's a couple of people that come to mind. The first was really early in my career. Two girls showed up in my class one day. They were twins and they were refugees, didn't speak English, and just kind of looked at me. They didn't really know what was going on. Um, and one of them, just before I finished teaching, became my line manager for my
Wow.
teaching. And so we always had quite an interesting relationship. I'd known her when she was 11 years old and she was new and she had no idea what was going on. And then ultimately she was kind of my boss. So it really, it reminds me that my job at that time was to teach her geography 1 or 2 hours a week. Um, and it made a contribution to the fact that eventually she did learn the language and she could go on to lead her subject to become a teacher. But it requires everybody to do their little bit for somebody to be able to make that journey. But the other person I worked with, where again it's quite similar but quite a different circumstance. I was the head of our sixth form in our school, and one of my colleagues was very interested in that role and wanted to support and work alongside me. So we worked together for a long time. And at one point, the head teacher asked me to move on and do something else, and she took over the sixth form after me. And I continued to line manage her, but she took it forward. And when I was leading the sixth form, we moved it up one Ofsted grading, which isn't the only way you judge things, but it's one. When she took over the sixth form, she took it to the next level. And I don't think I could have done that. So I was really pleased to see that the thing we were both interested in was better when I stopped and she carried on than it would have been if I had carried on. And so I took a lot of satisfaction in her success in that sense because I could see that it was better than I would have done, but I could play a role in that. And I felt that was it's quite a big learning curve for me that actually success is not necessarily what you do, but sometimes it's what you help other people to do.
Yeah, definitely. And what are powerful examples that you bring in, like, from different experiences, different people, different backgrounds. So, and I think, yes, that's the real example of impactful leadership and the impact it can have on others. So, and I
Hmm.
think it also connects to how we define success. Uh, so many young people feel pressure to define success quickly. So how do you think the students in the early career professionals should approach success while exploring different opportunities?
I think we can get overwhelmed with success and focus on it too much, and then it becomes quite negative because our basically because we haven't got our eye on the ball. We're so busy thinking about where I'll end up at the end that I don't think about right now. And actually, the way to do well is generally to do what you're doing now as well as you possibly can. And that is not only in terms of things like getting promotion, but just having integrity, because you've got two options in a way. You've got one to get to the place you want to be without doing a good job, which really isn't a good place to be because you know that maybe you don't really deserve to be there. And the other is do a good job and then, in one sense, let other people decide where you're going to be because hopefully it doesn't always work out, but hopefully you will be successful in the end because you did a good job today. And I think that if I look back over my career and the things that have gone well, they've generally been rooted in being focused on as a teacher, teaching a good lesson today, looking after that student, marking that work, doing all the things you have to do day to day. Because then if someone's looking around for someone to lead, they say, okay, well, this guy does a good job, therefore that's one of the things we need as a leader. If you're not a good classroom teacher, you're probably not going to be a very good leader in a school. And it doesn't matter what job you do, if you can't do the basics well, you're not going to be able to go on and do the next thing. And equally, when you are a leader, I think, thinking about on each occasion when you're doing an interview, when you're supporting a colleague, when you're still teaching lessons, we need to be doing all those things well because they're the components that make up success at the end of the day. And just saying, you've got more money in a higher position doesn't really mean much if you're not doing a good job. And, one of the great things that you see over time is doesn't matter what level you're at, you need to do today's job well and not worry so much about the future. Let it worry about itself.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where uncertainty plays a big role because, you're always uncertain. You're thinking of other opportunities all the time. And sometimes in that moment, sometimes we're not able to do what we exactly meant to do. And I think this really challenges how we think about success sometimes early on.
Yeah. I think in some ways, don't think about success.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just
Don't
becomes a distraction.
Yeah, just don't think about it, just do what you can do. And like all this uncertainty also is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. It's a way of exploring things. So just do the best you can do at that moment, what you're doing, and then grow from that along the journey. So enjoy the process.
Very much so.
Yeah, okay. And with that in mind, like, because you're working with really kind of the people who really more support, like middle leadership. So leadership can be demanding. So what
Yeah.
habits or approaches have you seen help leaders grow sustainably without burning out?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question, to be honest. And, I think you give great advice, but it doesn't necessarily always work for everybody because it it really depends on the decisions we make as leaders. And so I would say everything I already said is quite true. I mean, in one sense, I say don't go looking for leadership too much because if you're doing a good job, it will find you, and then focus on the job you're doing. But I suppose the thing that's become one of my mantras recently is to think about taking the next step, not being perfect. And one of the bits of advice I found most helpful to people was when they would come and say, I'm so overwhelmed, I've got this list of things to do. We could go down the list and say, that one there you can do in 2 years from now. And I've literally seen people relax when they think, oh, I don't need to do that now. And of course, you can't do everything at once. And there are some things you can't do until you've done something else. And it's quite easy to get that kind of sense of overwhelm. So when I first became a teacher, my line manager, she had targets for everybody in our team, and my one was survive. That was it for the whole year. And it's not a bad target at all. And I think when you come into middle leadership, it gets much more complicated. But it's really good to be kind of gentle with yourself and think, okay, realistically, what can I get done this year? And if, in teaching that is you need to plan out a new curriculum, that's a very big job. Spend a year doing it. And, if the year after you then start planning some trips or you add on some extra elements to that, then that's great. But you can build on top of what you've already done. If we're always trying to be perfect and build, the best thing possible, now, we're just going to get burnt out. But if we say, what's the next step towards what I want to achieve, then it can be done. And that requires some patience. But I think it also needs some limits. And this is a real problem. It's a problem in teaching. I think it's, again, probably an issue elsewhere that we can overcommit ourselves. And so it's really important to think about, how much am I willing to give? You've got a contract there which says how many hours you work and what your responsibilities are, and you need to do those things. And then you may want to do more than that and do extra things, and that's great. And that's what will make you into a really great professional. But you've also got to think, at this point, I'm stopping. At this point, I'm taking a break. At this point, I'm going to do something I enjoy, so that you then come back with enough energy to do the job well. Because otherwise, over time, you actually do the job worse. And then you end up not doing it at all because you've run out of energy, whether that is physically you can't do it or you just don't want to do it any longer. So I think keep those boundaries, pace yourself over time, and be kind to yourself at the heart of it.
No, that's great. Like I do agree with you on this as well, because otherwise it just always end up in burning out. And we've seen so many leaders who want to do everything at once end up burning out. So being patient and having a realistic goal really help them achieving those with a purpose. So thanks, James. That's such an important point. And I think this can also help them kind of a good balance between their work life and doing the job
Mm.
they wanted to do so and making a difference. So thank you for that. And can you share an example of a leader you have worked with whose approach to leadership inspired you, and what lessons young people can learn from them?
Yeah, no, I can't. The funny thing was, I thought about this and I thought, there's not one person I've worked with who I thought I really want to be like that person. There are different people over time who I've seen elements of. And there's one person I worked with quite early on who was amazing, got so much done, but then completely collapsed later on. And I would have said that was an inspiring leader at first, but in over the long run, I thought actually that isn't an inspiring leader. That's somebody who didn't get the balance right, and did great things. On the other hand, I've seen people who've got amazing vision and want to build great schools or great elements of schools, and yet they get undone by the fact they're not very practical and not really looking at the detail. And then other people who are so focused on the detail, they never really achieve the vision. But you know what? I came down to one person who I don't think anybody really would have said was a great leader, but the reason I thought of him was he partly because he survived. He carried on his career in leadership right the way to the end of his working time. He retired at the time he chose to. And what I always appreciated about him was that he had a perspective. So he never let the frustrations overwhelm him. And he never lost sight of the fact that the students in front of him, because we were working with teenagers, were people. And so I hardly ever saw him lose his temper or do anything that he might regret later. And he wasn't somebody who necessarily was hugely ambitious to do big projects or whatever, but he was consistent over time and people always knew he cared. And he was somebody I watched, like the parents of students would come back and remember when they had him as a teacher and really appreciate him. And that was the element of leadership that really stood out to me, that um, continuing to, again, it comes back to focusing on who's in front of you and what really matters. And my temptation as a leader is always to work on the big picture and on big plans, and I've got great ideas, but it can easily overwhelm the fact that there are individuals in front of you who need care and attention. And this guy actually always stuck in my mind because he never seemed to lose sight of that. And I think maybe that's important to me because it's actually not what I'm good at. So it sort of stood out to me. But I think that is something that really is a great leadership trait.
Yeah, and that's a great example. And I think from this example, there's lots young people can take from that, because most of the young people we have seen end up in frustration and lose their calm. And the example you have given, I think, is so much powerful to see how, like, keeping yourself in control
Mm.
uh, can make long-lasting impression on somebody.
Yeah.
So yeah, so thank you. And I also want to know, like, many successful leaders follow non-linear paths. So what
Mm.
advice would you give to young people about embracing uncertainty and unexpected opportunities?
Yeah. It's actually a very difficult question because it's so individual. But I would say from my own experience, if I go back to why I became a teacher, it was because I was so bored of the other jobs I was doing.
Okay.
Um, and I think you've got to be sensitive to that. I mean, one bit of advice I'd give to younger people is don't be afraid to change jobs or change careers. You've got to be there long enough to get a sense of whether this is right or wrong. But early in your time working, you people will forgive you for walking out on not literally walking out, but for changing jobs quite rapidly. because you've got to get to a place where you feel comfortable. So some of the people I most admire actually came into teaching later from other careers. And one guy I worked with for quite a while, he said, he had a much better paid job. He said he had a much nicer car and all of those things. But he said the job he was doing was so boring, he couldn't see himself being there for another 30 years. So he left it and became a teacher. And he said he much more enjoyed that because of the interaction with people. I've seen people go in the other direction. And if you can't see yourself still doing that in 5, 10, 20 years' time, then go and do something else. Um, of course, if you do nothing, you don't know. So I think that's, in a way, that's the advice is go and try stuff. And if you don't like what you're doing, look for another option. And early on, people will forgive you for that. And I think if you don't do that later on, you may not forgive yourself if you find yourself in a job you really don't want to be doing after a very long period of time.
Yeah, definitely. And I've written a chapter in my book as well. Experiences are greater than perfection, and enjoy the journey and do explore lots of careers, lots of different areas, sometimes you're never exposed to. So it's lots out in the world. So there's always a scope to change careers. And it's all about what you like to do, what your strengths are. You build up those strengths and your interests. So that can align with your passion as well and who you are becoming rather than what you want to be. So
Yeah.
there's a difference between these two questions.
And
So
and I think, sorry, I was going to say, I think one of the other things when I talk to people who are not in teaching, we always agree that what you want is somebody who who works hard and is competent. And I think if you're going between careers, yes, you need to know certain things for different jobs. But at the end of the day, if you're a hard worker and you are competent, you'll take responsibility, you'll do whatever you're doing, you'll do it well, you can move across careers, you can move to different roles. Uh, it's less about, the particular job, and it's more about your character. And that's what really makes a good employee, no matter which career you're in.
and this is what the soft skills are, which we call as the power skills or the human skills,
Mhm.
because that can go along with you. Doesn't matter what job you're doing as a
Yeah.
human, as a person first. And in this world, changing world, the world of AI, everything is changing so quickly, and all these the soft skills or the human skills, I say, will go along with you forever. It doesn't matter how drastically the world will change with this AI, and
Yeah.
even more in the future. So thank you, James. Thank you for sharing that insight. So, from your work across schools and networks, how do people's definition of success evolve over time? And what can students and young professionals learn from that?
I think this is really fascinating, and I've learned a lot about this in recent years. And I wish I had thought of it before, actually, or found it before, because people, in a way, it's not younger people you need to talk to. It's it's people in the middle of their career,
Mm.
because we've all heard the stories of the midlife crisis and the guy who buys a Porsche or a motorbike or whatever because he's not sure what's going on. But what I learned was, and there's a lot of theory going back thousands of years about this, is that at different times in life, we actually need to be doing different things. So it's quite normal in your 20s and 30s to be very keen, working very hard, trying to earn money, do things like buy a house and get into a relationship and start families and all those things. That's quite normal and right. And if you don't do that, you haven't got that kind of cushion to or that foundation to build on later. But when you get into your 40s and 50s, it's also quite normal to change a bit and not to be continually trying to accumulate and do these things, but actually take a different stance, partly leading other people. So you're then the person who's helping that person who's coming in their early 20s to establish themselves and do those sorts of things. Partly slow down because actually now you can rely on expertise a bit more. You don't have to be always creating new things, which you might be doing early in a career. And it depends who you talk to, but there are different stages of life that you go through. And I think understanding that stops you panicking when suddenly you find maybe at, 45 or something, you're not really that keen to do this anymore. You're a bit bored of it. That's actually quite normal. And I think it's something that no one really tells you when you're young that, you'll have energy to really work a lot when you're in your 20s and 30s. it runs out after a while. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything. It means you have to really think differently about what you're doing. And I've really enjoyed that in the last few years, actually, that I can now put energy into quite different things to what I was doing 20 years ago and find a lot of satisfaction in things that I wouldn't have found satisfying back then. Um, and one of those things is sort of feeding into other people. So the growth network is all about supporting people to grow both professionally and personally. And whilst that's in some way been interesting to me for a long time, I think now I really enjoy focusing on that almost uniquely. In the past, there were other things I wanted to do, and I think just being aware that that's all right is so important.
Yeah, and that's a really valuable perspective, how success evolves. Um,
Mm.
so that and thank you for sharing that. And I'm really enjoying, and I think the ones who are listening this podcast will definitely get so much to take from this episode.
Thank
So
you.
just one last question to ask, like looking back, what advice would you give your younger self about leading with impact, balance, and purpose, and how can young people apply that today?
Yeah, I'd probably come back to the same thing about just do do the thing that you're doing now, focus on it and do it well, and probably do less. I think I quite often took a lot on, worked really hard, which is great. Working hard is a good thing. But there were times when it would have been better to have slowed up a bit and given more energy to one thing rather than spreading it across two or three. So I th and I think focusing on people as well is really important. It's quite easy when we've got a big idea or a big project to think that's the most important thing and the people are not. And particularly in education, you're working for people, working with people. It really matters that you focus on the individuals in front of you. But again, there's people all over the place. And, we only really do work at the end of the day for people.
Yeah.
And I think we mustn't lose sight of that because, they talk about with burnout, it's not the amount of work you're doing, it's losing the purpose. And I think from the very beginning, if we remember that it's all about people, then that gives the purpose and that enables us to keep going. And I think the other thing is to find the boundaries to make sure how far you are willing to go for your work and really think about, what are the other things in your life? Because work can really take over and suddenly you find you've been going 20 years and you haven't thought about anything else. And you think, there's other things I wish I had been doing. And I think from early on, it's worth just thinking about what are the things I really don't want to let go of. And that's relationships and people, and it's activities and hobbies and things like that outside of work. Um, just keep an eye on that because you don't want to wake up one day and think, oh yeah, I missed out on some of the things that I really wanted.
And that's really powerful advice because, it's no regrets. So you live life without regrets.
Mhm.
When you look back into your journey 20 years down the line, or 10 years, or maybe even 5 years, you can proudly say, yes, I've done something. Uh, and this gives me satisfaction. This is what my life purpose is about. So yeah, thank you, James, for today. That was a really, really insightful conversation today. And I think one of the biggest takeaway from this episode is that leadership isn't just about titles or progressions, but it's about growing with purpose, supporting others, and maintaining balance along the way. So
Right.
for anyone who is listening, feels uncertain about their future, and I think this is your reminder that it's okay not to have everything figured out. Your path will evolve as you grow. So thank you again for joining us, James, today. And for everyone who is listening this episode, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to follow Lab to Ed Leadership and share it with someone who might need to hear this. So see you in the next episode. Thank you.